Good morning and welcome to New Testament Literature and Interpretation. We're looking at an incredibly interesting topic today. And it's the idea, is the Bible somehow anti-woman? When you look at the details of the Bible, is it pro-woman? Is it anti-woman? Is there something in the Bible that, modern culture has taught us to kind of dismiss? And we're going to look at this today. And of course, there are a lot of different opinions on it, different opinions within evangelicalism. And I want to present one, the complementarian view. But we're going to look at the data, and I think at the end we'll be much more encouraged than where we're going to start out. So let's dive into this topic. Is the Bible anti-woman? And as always, don't forget to make a forum post and one reply. That's how I'm keeping the attendance while we're doing this in terms of virtual classroom. And as always, I'm praying for your continued safety in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. So when we come to this idea, this is how I want to organize my talk today. Why is it that some people come to the Bible and see it as somehow anti-woman? That is, as part of, some kind of male patriarchal society, and that we've really, we know better than that today. So we want to come and we want to look at that. We want to look at the arguments. We want to look at the New Testament's complementarian view. And so in fairness, I want to be up front where I land in this. I've heard very good arguments from my evangelical egalitarian friends. I'm part of a minority that remains unconvinced that that's how we should interpret the text. I'm convinced that the New Testament is presenting a complementarian view, that God created men and God created women, each with unique things, and he did it for a theological purpose. He did it for a reason, and we want to look at that reason today. And I want to bring into this discussion biblical theology. I think in many ways what's been lacking in the contemporary discussion is a whole Bible biblical theology. And I think when you step back and you start realizing what the Bible is doing and what the Bible is saying, that it goes from being somehow anti-woman to being the most pro-woman document that you could ever imagine, but it does it in a way that is preserving this New Testament complementarian view. And then at the end, I'll just give some practical advice as a minister in a denomination, a conservative denomination, and where we might go forward with this discussion. So let's dive in. So we're going to go through this slide, and in about 5 minutes, when we get through, you're going to probably have the idea, hey, that guy has dug himself the biggest hole and he'll never climb out of it. But what I want to do is just go through and point out some of the more difficult text. And they're texts that, evangelicals, we often will avoid them and pretend like they're not in the Bible. But the problem is when someone goes through and reads them without a way to kind of process what's going on in terms of biblical theology, it just becomes overwhelming, and people immediately come to the point the Bible is anti-woman and just reject biblical revelation. So I admit that what we're going to look through will be a little scary, for 5 minutes or so, but hang in there. And I think by the end of today, our discussion, that most of these are going to go from being like huge problems in the text to glorious parts of this unbelievable meta-narrative of Jesus in the church. So why do some people say the Bible is anti-woman? Well, just off the bat, the man is created first and then the woman. In fact, the woman is house built out of the essence of the man. That's the word that's used in both Hebrew, bana, it's the same word like build a house or build a temple, and oikodomeo, the same exact word, house, build, literally in the Septuagint, and that's the word used in the New Testament, edify, but the man's created first and then the woman. And perhaps more troubling on the first read is that women, and it's not just some women, it's all women, are excluded from the tabernacle and particularly excluded from the Holy of Holies. The one possible exception to that is an adulterous woman. If she's accused, she is taken in to the presence of God. I don't think she's taken into the Holy of Holies, but it may be. I'm a little unclear when I read the text in Hebrew whether if she's taken in the tabernacle building, but if she's accused, then part of that accusation is made before God. But other than that, women are excluded. And so the conclusion is, well, that just shows that this is a patriarchal society. Women can't go in. Many people have pointed out in this story that Adam names the woman and that he had named the animals. And so many people will come to that and say, look, the woman is being just put on the same level with the other created things, and Adam is naming those things, and he names his wife. Very troubling for many is there's a list of the valuation of humans when they make a vow. I think it's when they make a vow that a person of a certain age, there's a monetary value placed on that. And for a woman between 20 and 50 years old, the value placed on her in that list is 20 shekels. A shekel is about 2 days' wages for a laborer. So if we call that $100, then the value in this list, in the Old Testament, is going to be about $6,000. For a man that same age, between 20 and 50, his valuation is 50 shekels, or about $10,000. So he's 40% in that list. He's valued 40% more than she is. And that same list, if someone's under 20, a man's under 20, he's 20 shekels or something like that. And if he's over 50, the price goes down. And the same for women. And so the conclusion that many people make is somehow the Bible is anti-woman. Very troubling here. A little girl baby makes her mother unclean for 80 days. 66 of those days are she's unclean, and then 14 days, and kind of double her monthly uncleanness. She's counted, so you put that together, it's 80 days. For a little boy baby, It's half that, 33 days, and then 7 days like the monthly uncleanness. And so you come to that text and you say, my goodness, why would a little girl baby's birth make her mother twice as unclean for a little boy baby? And so many people say, obviously, the Bible is anti-woman. Another troubling passage, and we're just being honest here, looking at what are the passages people are going to bring forward. Well, a woman's oath is not counted valid unless it's ratified by her father or her husband. If she makes the oath, but it's ratified, affirmed by either her father or husband, then that oath does not count. In the New Testament, the woman is called the weaker vessel. In the New Testament, women are called to submit to their own husbands, hupotasso, be ordered under their own husbands. In the New Testament, women are excluded from having authority over a man, and there's a word there, althentane, as I remember it in Greek, and there is some debate exactly what that means, but the verse exists, and Paul says we have no other practices in the churches, and he says if someone doesn't, accept what I say is kind of God's word, then let that person not be accepted. So he seems very forward on that. In the New Testament, church leadership is exclusively male. The disciples, 12 disciples, are male. Elders, the requirement of elders are male. There is some debate about whether they're women deacons. I think Phoebe is called a deacon, and it's not the feminine version of the word. It's just spelled exactly the same way. And you could make the argument wives likewise in the qualification of deacons. Of course, in Greek, you can translate that women. And Pliny the Younger in 116 AD, who's not a believer, talks about two deaconesses in a church that he tortured to death, try to get them to blaspheme. So the idea of a woman deacon, there's some evidence there, but in terms of eldership and the leadership of a church and standing up and saying, "Thus saith the Lord," you don't really get any evidence that I'm aware that leadership in the church was ever a woman. And so in the New Testament times, at least, that church leadership is all male. And then very troubling here, a passage many people are, going to just flat out reject. Paul says that man is the image and glory of God, and that woman is the glory of man. And, people are going to come to that and say, Paul is just hopelessly out of touch with reality, and he's a patriarchal society, and, that's what Christianity taught then, but, this is Christianity now. And so many people say the Bible is anti-woman. And then lastly, Paul says Adam was not deceived in the garden, but that Eve was deceived. So we look at that, and I imagine, if I'm a conservative minister, I serve at Bryan College, interdenominational school, very happily. We have people from all kinds of different traditions, and on the view of egalitarianism and complementarianism, we have people who represent different sides of that argument. But I'm on the conservative side, and I think what would be fairly said the historical side And yet, when you look at all of these passages, I imagine you say, there's no way this guy can do anything with that, because that's just too much. And we just need to, forget about that. Well, there are three approaches that people have taken to this problem. The first is kind of a non-Christian approach, but it's where many people have landed, and that is just to reject the Bible and to say, the Bible isn't true. This is what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches an anti-woman view, and because the Bible teaches that, we just need to reject the Bible, or at least reject those parts of the Bible that we don't like. And so you get someone like Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, and he comes to these passages and similar passages, and he says, look, the Bible is just hopelessly out of touch. And so he writes this: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, if you don't know what that means somebody who hates women, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. And then on the next page he says, and it's unfair to attack such an easy target. The God hypothesis should not stand or fall on its most unloving instantiation, Yahweh, nor on his insipidly opposite Christian face, gentle Jesus, meek and mild. And so a lot of people are going to come to an issue like this issue about women and say, well, it just shows the Bible isn't true. We should just reject it outright. Well, I know why people say that, but Dawkins' position is silly when it comes to this idea of God being somehow misogynistic, that somehow God hates women. And I'm going to make the case why not only is he wrong, but he's 180 degrees wrong, and it's silly. I would expect more from an Oxford professor just in terms of the literature of the Bible, but we're going to look at it. We're going to look at all of these, but that's kind of option one, just reject the Bible. And many people are going to do that and have done that. Many people in the West are looking at difficult issues like this and just saying, well, the Bible isn't true. A more common approach would be the approach of my egalitarian friends within evangelicalism, and that is to say, yes, the Bible says things like male leadership, but we really don't have to follow that anymore. And in America, since about 1815, that's been the avenue that many people have taken. And they would say, okay, these texts exist, but we'll either ignore them or we'll interpret them in a way where female leadership within the church is okay. And so since about 1815, you have various denominations. I think this is from the Wikipedia page, and who've kind of joined that. So some of these are non-Christian groups, like this Unitarian group, but you do have, Methodist, and by the 20th century, it was becoming more and more common, where today it's very common for churches, even relatively conservative churches, to support the ordination of women. There are few denominations that are not doing that, and my denomination is one, the Presbyterian Church in America, because we believe that's just not what the Bible is teaching. The Bible is teaching a complementarian view that would say that, yes, the leadership in a church is male, but there's going to be a follow-up with this in terms of biblical theology. So this would be kind of option 2. You come to the text and you just don't follow the New Testament qualifications for elder. You say, well, that was then, this is now, and kind of reinterpret. And there are many evangelicals who are saying that's the path we should go. Listen to their arguments, be a Berean, you decide for yourself. But I want to take the third approach, and that is the approach of biblical theology. And biblical theology would say that the Bible is God's word, and it should be treated, that everything in the Bible should be read in light of everything else in the Bible. And once you start doing that, this issue about God being anti-woman, it just won't stand. Because the Bible is saying that when God created male and female, that it wasn't that he needed to do that in a way to get things to procreate. Even in the natural world today, you have lots of things that can reproduce asexually. So it's not like God needed male and female. But what God says about it is that there's a theological reason. So Paul writes this, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And then Paul adds this statement, this mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. In other words, what the Bible is saying is when God created man and woman, when God dreamed up maleness and femaleness, that he wasn't doing that in a vacuum, that he had from the very first Christ and the church in mind. We've talked in this class before about human sexuality, and the world's view of human sexuality within marriage is that, okay, even that's some kind of slightly dirty thing. We even use that language when talking about sexuality sometimes in our culture. But the Bible has exactly the opposite view, that God was singing about Christ in the church, and he said, well, what can I do to create, a theological lesson? And God says, I'll create human sexuality. I'll create the incredible love between a man and a woman and the pleasure between a man and a woman. And then I'll tell people, hey, that's a cartoon version of something that's beyond that and more real in heaven. I'll let people experience on earth within marriage this most intimate of relationships and most pleasurable of relationships. And then I'll tell them, hey, that's a cartoon version of something way better than that in heaven. And so when God designed a woman and designed everything about a woman, that was what he primarily had in mind. And when God designed a man, that's what he primarily had in mind. And the intrinsic things within maleness and femaleness are there for theological reasons. That this is teaching something theologically. And that's what Paul is saying. This is a great mystery. And God did it because he was singing about Christ in the church. God created human sexuality with a theological purpose in mind. He wanted human sexuality to point beyond itself to a greater spiritual truth. And what I would say is that everything in the Bible that's spoken of, and the failures of men in the Bible, point to the success of Jesus. The failures of women in the Bible point to the success of the new Eve, the church. And it's only when you begin to realize that purpose is there that you start getting an idea of just where the meta-narrative is going in the story, and why those passages that we saw in that troubling slide, that some of those start making perfect sense when you start realizing, hey, this is a meta-narrative truth going on. And notice this, if you're trying to make the idea that the Bible's anti-woman, notice that the Bible starts and ends with a cosmic wedding. So you have a man and a woman being married in the Garden of Eden, and notice that the end of the book of Revelation is a man, only it's not the dirt man Adam, it's the God man Jesus, and that he is experiencing a cosmic wedding with this one woman, his bride, the church. So that the whole church, having been unified and having been made one, is presented as this new Eve. And if you've ever been around weddings and two people, particularly two people who've waited to come together, you know it's the most joyous time in their lives, and they are delighting in one another and just are in love and just can't wait to be together. And of all the images that God could have picked for the eschatological consummation, that's the image he picked. These two people who are coming together in a marriage. And if God, the unity of the one God through the person of the Son, has chosen to incarnate forever to win the heart of one woman, if you can make that anti-woman, more power to you. That seems to me like the most romantic thing I've ever heard in my life, where God is doing the unthinkable to win the heart of this one glorious new Eve. Whatever the Bible says about men and women has to be seen in light of these two stories, the beginning and end. You've seen in this class over and over, whenever we've looked at anything, always look, how does it relate to what went before, and how does it relate to what's coming after? And if you do that, you start realizing that this image of this eschatological woman, it's part of the grand meta-narrative. So let's look at the connection between the Garden of Eden and the eschatological consummation. What we've learned in this class, and what we learned in Old Testament lit, is that the earthly tabernacle is a copy of the heavenly real tabernacle. They serve as a copy, a shadow of heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the temple, he was instructed by God, saying, "See to it that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." So that's what God's word says in Hebrews. It should say Hebrews, plural, 8:5. Now, if that's true, then if the earthly tabernacle is like the Garden of Eden, then the real Garden of Eden is in heaven. And I just ask, were women allowed in the Garden of Eden? And the answer is yes. And will women be in the restored Garden of Eden? And the answer is yes. So the temporary exclusion from the pattern on earth is simply foreshadowing of the day when the Redeemer would come to bring his bride back into the pleasure of the Garden of Eden. The temporary exclusion is just part of the narrative structure of the text. And I would have expected an Oxford professor like Richard Dawkins to realize, hey, this is a literary function in the Bible. You've got to read it that way. You wouldn't read any other book the way that he's childishly, in my opinion, reading the Bible. He's not reading the whole. He's not. He needs to get some, biblical theology people and read, because what he's presenting there just won't work on that issue. When we come to the garden, and we've seen this before, come to the tabernacle, we've seen how it looks like the garden and how there are cherubs there. And this is going to be very important in the story elsewhere, because cherubs are given the command to keep sinners out of the presence of God. What makes Eden pleasure is what the word Eden means. What makes the garden of pleasure Eden is the fact that God's there. God is the most interesting, the most worthy of love entity that exists anywhere. And cherubs are told to keep sinful people out of God's presence. And so you've got all these things in the tabernacle with cherubs on there, and it's like a cosmic stop sign saying, if you're a sinful person, don't come here. And so the fact that women are excluded from the tabernacle, when I went over the slide, I kind of pasted over the fact that everybody's excluded from the tabernacle. All men are excluded from the tabernacle except a few priests, and even of the priests, all the priests are excluded from the Holy of Holies except the high priest, and he's excluded on every single day except the 10th day of the first month, Yom Kippur. So the fact that women are excluded, everybody's excluded at one time or another. And it's pointing to the issue in the meta-narrative that we all are dwelling outside of Eden right now. But the day will come when the new Eve is brought back in, and that day is celebrated at the end of Revelation. And so for me, someone would say, well, why are you excluding women from, leadership in the church? It's because we're not in heaven yet. In heaven, the man and woman will be emperor and empress. The Garden of Eden will be restored, and the day of consummation has come, and there is no restriction then. It's a little like when two people are engaged to be married, at least if they're following the biblical mandate. Those people aren't intimate with each other sexually because the day of the consummation has not come, and so they're waiting in anticipation of the day when God says, okay, enter into this new relationship, and they follow what God is saying. But until that day, different rules are in operation. And I think the same thing is happening in the church. People are saying, well, in heaven, these distinctions aren't going to be the same as they are on earth somehow, and therefore we should just do that in our churches today. That would say, well, we're there. We're already the eschatological marriage has already happened. And it doesn't seem to me, at least, that that's what the Bible is saying, that we are living in the already and not yet, but there is an element where that final consummation hasn't happened. And so, in effect, the exclusion is simply a reminder that the day is coming. And when we're listening to Christ and listening to male leadership and pointing us to the day when Christ will be the one who speaks authoritatively, we're simply doing that in anticipatory worship, longing for the day when the earth is filled with the knowledge of the glory of God as the waters fill the sea. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing that we're doing that. It in no way is negating the value of women. It's simply pointing to Christ and the church. We're excluded by these cherubs. The high priest alone can go into the Holy of Holies, and he once a day, and he with blood, and he would put blood between those cherubs. Now, if you're tracking with me in this at all, you might say, okay, well, you're making a little bit of a case. You're making a little bit of a case, but you might be thinking, I remember that slide. Oh my goodness, all those things, valuation of women and oaths and all that. How in the world can you make any of that make sense? Well, sometimes when you come to the Bible, for most issues, you can come to any translation of the Bible and any language, and it's going to give you exactly what all the other versions are going to say. And, you do it, and you don't have to know the original. It just makes sense. It's clear. On these debated issues, every now and then, knowing something about the original language will give you a key that will just open this glorious meta-narrative. And hey, I just want to make a shameless plug. If you get an opportunity to study Greek or Hebrew, I started studying 1982. I guess that's 38 years ago now. And my professor told me that Greek would be the hardest class I would ever love. And he was right. 38 years later, that love for Greek has become a love for all the biblical languages, because on difficult issues like this, they'll pay you back. And it's going to pay us back today massively. So you put blood on the top of the Ark of Covenant between these two angels. And you say, well, why should that be important? Well, I want you to look at something with me. If you have a paper Bible, I want you to go get it. Pause the video, go get a paper Bible. And I want you to look up Genesis 50:26. And when you look up Genesis 50:26, it's going to say something. It doesn't matter what translation you have, but it's going to say something like they put Joseph in a box in Egypt. And that word box in Hebrew is this word Aharon. Now, and you might say, well, why is that important? Well, that word Aharon, every other time it's used in the Hebrew Bible, every other time, it means the Ark of the Covenant. So when you meet it, the second use in the Hebrew Bible, this word Ark, and the use everywhere else after that, it's the word Ark of the Covenant. But Genesis 50:26 shows that that word is used also of the word coffin. In fact, the first time that you run into Aharon, it means coffin. And so it's really weird, is it not, that at the center of the Holy of Holies is what looks like a little coffin, and that two angels are on either end of it, and that on the Day of Atonement there's blood between those two angels. But that's what the text would tell us if we were reading it in Hebrew. Now, in English, they don't follow that. So, we translate Ark of the Moses basket, and then the vessel that Noah was. That's a different word. Tabah, I think, in Hebrew is that word. But this word, Ark of the Covenant, is Aharon, or Aharon. Wish I could pronounce Hebrew better. And it's used of coffin in 50:26. And you might say, well, why should I care about that at all? Well, I want you to think about a story with me. This is John's account of the resurrection appearances. In many ways, John's filling in the gaps left by the other Gospels. And this is what he says, and he's adding to the Matthew, Mark, and Luke accounts. He's filling in, and these are the details that he wants us to camp on. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark, saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. In the part that I've left out here, John and Peter, they hear from her that the tomb is empty, and they race to see, and they both end up sticking their heads in the tomb, but they don't see anything except they see Jesus's grave clothes in a pile, and then they see this napkin that was over his face folded up. And John says that when he saw that, he believed. He realized that Jesus had risen from the dead, and that everything Jesus had told him was exactly true. And he realized that the moment he stuck his head in and saw the grave clothes and the face covering. But then John wants us to realize that something else happened. And this is what he said happened. Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she stooped to look in. So these two men, Peter and John, looked in. They didn't see anything except the grave clothes. There was enough evidence there that they believed, but they saw that and then they left. And so the woman was standing outside, and she, as the third one to do this, she stuck her head in. But John says she saw something different. Notice what the text says. She saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus was slain, one at the head and one at the feet. Now, G. Campbell Morgan says one of the best things you can do in biblical interpretation, get all the facts and then have a sanctified imagination. I want you to imagine what she saw. So she had just seen these two people that she had told, they had gone in, they saw, they went away believing. She's crying, and she sticks her head in and she sees something different. She sees two angels and the place where Jesus had lain. Now, I want you to imagine what that looked like. She's looking in this little cave, looking on this little stone place where they laid bodies, wrapped up bodies, and she sees it. So here's my question. Do you think there was blood between those two angels? Because I'm starting to realize, okay, you've got a thing and it's called a coffin, okay, and there's blood on top of it and two angels there, and now Mary Magdalene is seeing these two super angels, and maybe there's blood between them, and the two angels say to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said, "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they had laid them." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. Jesus said, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" And then the text says this: supposing him to be the gardener. So Adam comes to a garden and turns it into a tomb. Jesus comes to a tomb and throws open the gates of paradise. When Jesus died on the cross, the cherubs on the veil in the temple, that veil was ripped in two. The ones who are excluding us, in Revelation, they're the four living creatures. They're not hacking us to death because we're not sinners anymore. Jesus has raised us from the dead, and he's bringing us back to the garden. And notice, remember what was said about the earthly tabernacle, that it was the copy. If you want to think of it, it's kind of the fake view. But there's a real. And here we see someone seeing the real. And notice it's not a man. Only men could go in the Holy of Holies. Everyone's excluded, only the priests. Now, Jesus, as the ultimate priest, has thrown open the real gates to Eden. And he's welcoming this first woman in, and she's standing in his presence, and she has no idea. She thinks he's a gardener. He is the gardener, just not the garden she was thinking of. He's the gardener of the Garden of Eden. He's the prophet, the priest, the king. He's the ultimate Adam. And she is being included in this new Eve. All people are being included in the new Eve. All people, that is, who are coming to Jesus by faith and being incorporated into his bride, the church, his bride that God is house building out of his essence as he puts the heart of Jesus, as he makes this church the body of Jesus on earth. Is that anti-woman? Or is that not the most pro-woman thing you've ever heard in your life, that God incarnate, to win the heart of this one new woman, this new Eve, his bride, the church, that he's done the unthinkable. He's incarnated forever. He, though being rich, he for our sake became poor. He suffered her debt, and he's giving her a new heart, and he's remaking her. Well, what about that 20 shekels and 30 shekels thing? Well, here's the passage. Speak to the people of Israel. Say, if anyone makes a special vow involving valuations of persons, then the valuation of a male from 20 years to 60 years be 50 shekels, $10,000. If the person is a female, 30 shekels. 1 shekel is 2 days' wages, about $200, $6,000. And you might say, well, you can't do anything with that. Well, you're probably right. I can't do anything with that, but the text surely does something with that, because it tells us that when Joseph is sold by his brothers, he's 17 years old. He's sold for the going value, 20 shekels. He's sold into slavery. If a person dies, that same valuation is in play. But notice Jesus, and remember, Jesus is 30 years old when he's crucified. So the going rate for Jesus would have been 50 shekels. But look at what the text says. Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, what will you give me if I deliver you over him? And they paid him 30 shekels of silver. And from that moment, he saw an opportunity. They meant that as an insult price. They were saying, one, Jesus isn't a real man. We won't give you the 50 that, the text says. We'll give you the price of a woman. Or we'll give you the price of a slave. Both of those are the same, 30 shekels. They meant it as an ultimate insult. But God, in the meta-narrative, is saying that the God-man was valued at the price of a woman or the price of a slave. They meant it as an insult, and God meant it as meta-narrative elegance, because he did give his life for a slave. Anyone who commits a sin is a slave to sin. We were all in spiritual slavery in Egypt until our Joshua Jesus comes, until God comes, until the new Moses comes and takes us out and leads us, and we go through the waters in baptism, and then we're led on this journey that culminates in the land flowing with milk and honey, the restoration of the Garden of Eden. Moses can't get us there. Joshua Jesus can get us there, because Joshua Jesus has become the purchase price to free us from slavery. And he's so in love with his one bride, the church, that he's willing to give his life for her. What I think my evangelical friends in the complementarian or the egalitarian school miss is the elegance of that story. Because in effect, they're buying in the argument of the world that a woman can't be happy unless she's a man. And that's just not true. There are things that God created that only women can do. I mean, how many times have you heard that foolish statement, whatever a man can do, I can do better? I mean, our little girls are taught that from an early age, and that's foolish, because ask yourself the inverse of that. Could I, as a man, say to a woman, anything you can do, I can do better? It's like, well, no. God has created women to take seed from a man and turn that seed into an eternal creature, a glorious image of God. And there isn't a man in the world who could do that if his life depended on it. He's just incapable. Because God created maleness and femaleness for a theological reason. And maleness is glorious to God, and femaleness is glorious to God. And femaleness isn't maleness, and maleness isn't femaleness. there are parts that each of us play in this meta-narrative drama. And at the end of the day, all of those details are really just cartoon versions of the real reality of Christ in the church. And my fear is that when we jump on this egalitarian bandwagon too quickly, we miss the glory of the meta-narrative and the glory of the new Adam and what he's come to do. I threw this slide in there. I don't even know why I did it, but it's just pointing out that the word Judas, here's the text that it's actually the word Judah. So, Judah is the one who sells Joseph, and Judas the one who hands over Jesus. This is a meta-narrative. You've got to read it as a meta-narrative. When you come to a difficult text, step back and say, what's this teaching me about God's glorious picture? So when we come to the most difficult one, man ought not to cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. What Paul's saying is, look, there's a meta-narrative. And the meta-narrative is there because God wanted the woman house built out of the essence of the man, because there's going to be this glorious woman, the new Eve, and she's going to be oikodemeod, house built out of the essence of the God-man Jesus. His perfected human heart is going to be given to her, and she's going to be like him. She's going to talk like him and act like him and relate to God like him, but she's still a woman. She's not a man. Because the church isn't going to become Jesus. Jesus is always going to be Jesus in heaven. He's always going to be the head. He's always going to be the lawgiver in Zion. She is never going to sit Jesus down and say, well, let me give you a piece of my mind. You need to do this, that, or the other thing. That's just not how the marriage in heaven is going to work, because Jesus is perfect. And the woman, the glorious woman in heaven, is going to perfectly submit, happily submit. And what's happening on earth is simply a foreshadowing of that. Once you understand the meta-narrative, you almost begin to ask, well, is God anti-male? Because all the joined churches presented as this new Eve. Well, doesn't that kind of exclude the maleness? And I think God would say, okay, don't push the analogy too far. It is an analogy. But it is pointing out that there's something fundamentally right about maleness and femaleness when you're describing the church, because as the church relates to Jesus, there's something glorious about that, something uniquely feminine about that. And that's a great thing. And Paul's saying, don't brush over that. Don't try to, blur these distinctions. God doesn't want you to blur distinctions. If God created these things, he wants it celebrated. He wants the ability of men to fight and defend and to be single-minded, devoted to truths. There's something glorious about that. The same thing, there's something nurturing and caring and glorious about a woman's interaction with her children, that very few men can even come close, remotely close. There's something glorious about the ability of a woman to think about many different things at the same time. they have this multitasking ability that few men can even come close to that multitasking ability. And it seems to me as Christians and as conservative Christians that we ought to come to maleness and femaleness in the Bible and say, everything about this is glorious. Everything about it is created by God, and everything about it has a theological, spiritual purpose. And I think once you realize that, even a text like this starts making sense when you realize how Paul's thinking through it. Just end here by the man is told to work it and to guard and keep the garden, and the woman is his helper. What's interesting about that, I don't know if you can tell this or not. In Hebrew, this is the word and this is the word to, and this is the word guard, and this is the word to, and this is the word it. But this word work and keep, I don't know if you can tell, but this is exactly what the Levites are to do in the temple. They're to work it and to guard it. And the point I want to make there is that did this include the man and the woman? And clearly, if the woman is to help her husband, she is to help him guard and keep. And if that's what's going on in the temple, and remember, the earthly temple is a shadow of the heavenly temple. Well, my question is, will the woman help guard and keep the real temple? And if she is the new Eve, absolutely. Where the first Eve failed and where the first Adam failed, the new Adam and the new Eve will never fail. So my practical advice is, what does the world say about being a woman? I think the world says lots of different things. What does God say about being a woman? And that of the picture of, if you've ever been around people when they marry, and you just see a man so in love with his wife and a woman so in love with her husband, God is saying that's how you should think about Christ in the church. And the most glorious picture that I can picture of that is the church as the bride. Is that anti-woman? Is that somehow valuing women less? That seems like an incredibly difficult thing to argue when you realize that what God is saying about womanhood is radically different. What does the world say about being a man? Well, the world says about being a man that it's toxic, and that if you're a man and you want to defend and you want to provide, that there's something wrong with that. You should unman yourself and become a woman. And that's not what God says about being a man. God says about being a man, be committed to your wife, be unthinkably committed to your wife, be foolishly committed to your wife, give yourself for your wife's betterment, fight to the death to defend her. That's what you were made to do. If you're a man, don't ever apologize for being a man. God made you a man. If you're a woman, don't apologize for being a woman. God made you a woman. God made the maleness and the femaleness to point beyond themselves to a greater spiritual truth. What does the world say about male leadership in the church? It says it's backwards, it's wrong, it's wrong-headed, it's misses the mark. Well, are you going to be against Jesus' leadership in heaven? If the maleness points to Christ in the church, is it going to be a bad thing if Jesus leads in that couple's relationship in heaven? I don't think anybody would make that argument. And so Maybe we should ask the question, what does God say about male leadership in the church? Does it point beyond itself? Is it pointing to some kind of glory for Christ? This is what Richard Dawkins says, but it seems to me that that's a childish approach to the meta-narrative of Scripture. The second approach, I know why people are doing it. It's a convenient thing. It's an easy thing. Maybe it's right. I want to be under the Bible, not over the Bible. I can't find the justification for this in the Bible, and so I'm going to go with the biblical theological approach that there's something glorious about it, and I want to submit to that, and I want to learn what God wants me to learn. And so I just end here. There's one Son of God, who became the Son of Man to redeem one daughter of Adam and to make her the empress of the universe, the new Eve, untemptable by evil and gloriously beautiful, to live with himself in love in the garden city of New Jerusalem, and she will share his sonship forever. In fact, Jeremiah even has them called by the same name, Yahweh Sidkenu. Yahweh is our righteousness. My prayer for you today is that Yahweh will be your righteousness. I'll see you next time.